What happens when a 27-year-old woman walks into the Senate and outclasses one of the most ruthless political legends of our time? This isn't just another hearing. It's the moment James Carville tried to destroy her with insults. And she answered with 5 words that stopped the nation. If you think politics has lost its dignity, wait until you hear Caroline Leavitt say, "I'm not done, sir." If that moment gave you chills, don't scroll away. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss another truth-telling moment. Drop a comment below. Did Leavitt just redefine political courage? And share this video with someone who still believes grace and grit can change a room.
What happens when an 80-year-old Democrat legend tries to humiliate a 27-year-old conservative press secretary on national TV? He thought it would be easy. He mocked her, attacked Trump, even dragged Melania into it. But what unfolded next stunned the entire country. With 5 quiet words and an iron resolve, Caroline Leavitt didn't just respond, she turned the tables in front of millions. This isn't just another political debate. It's a generational moment that shook Washington to its core. Stay with us, because once you hear how she finished him off, you'll never look at modern politics the same again. It was supposed to be a one-sided hearing until a 27-year-old woman flipped the entire room. That was the headline America didn't see coming. Inside the Senate chamber, where hearings are often dry and predictable, something rare was unfolding, something electric. On one side stood James Carville, 80 years old, the political warrior of a bygone era. He had advised Bill Clinton, torn through GOP campaigns for decades, and once famously called Donald Trump the most dangerous man in the world. On this day, he came armed not just with notes, but with years of experience and the full confidence of the liberal establishment. Across from him stood someone entirely different, Caroline Leavitt. Barely 27, sharp-eyed, firm-voiced, and completely unafraid. A rising star within the MAGA movement, she had never testified before the Senate. To many, she was just a press secretary, a spokesperson, not a strategist. But in that moment, she wasn't reading someone else's words. She was ready to fight for them. The hearing was billed as an inquiry into political ethics and the moral climate surrounding the Trump administration. But everyone knew what it really was, a public ambush. Carville wasn't just a witness, he was the centerpiece. The Democrats needed a show, and Carville was their showman. His opening remarks promised nothing short of a public reckoning, but what they got was something far more unexpected. He began with ease. His signature Louisiana drawl coated every sentence with casual disdain. "Let's stop pretending," he said. The last administration wasn't a government. It was a soap opera. Melania wasn't a first lady, she was a photo op stuck in a political marriage. He smiled as if the crowd were in on some great joke, but it didn't land. Some chuckled nervously, others shifted uncomfortably. Even before Leavitt opened her mouth, something had shifted in the room. She didn't flinch, she didn't blink. She simply waited, letting his words hang in the air, like smoke that had nowhere to settle. Then she began. "Mr. Carville," she said clearly, "when men attack women for who they marry, that's not politics. That's cowardice." The room froze. The line wasn't just clever, it was cutting, and it went straight to the gut of every American who'd ever been tired of personal smear tactics disguised as political commentary. Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. What she had instead was presence and truth. "You've spent your career mocking people," she continued. "But let me remind you, mocking someone's wife isn't courage. It's weakness dressed up in a cheap suit." For a brief moment, Carville's smirk faltered. It was the first crack. She turned slightly, addressing the Senate panel directly. "I didn't come here to defend tabloid narratives. I came here to speak truth, to represent a president who, despite relentless attacks, delivered record low unemployment, brought back American manufacturing, and put working families first. But if this hearing is about attacking women, then say that plainly." The words hit like a hammer. She had flipped the opening attack not just back on Carville, but on the entire premise of the hearing. From there, murmurs began to ripple. Viewers watching at home started texting, sharing, typing. "Who is she? She's not backing down." In less than 3 minutes, the hearing was no longer about the administration. It was about tone, about fairness, about whether the people leading these accusations had any moral standing left to make them. Carville tried to recover. He leaned forward, delivering another jab about Stormy Daniels and hush money and saying, "You can wrap corruption in a press release, but it's still corruption." Leavitt didn't even glance away. She paused, then responded with a look that said, "I've heard better lines on daytime TV." Then came her answer, "The Trump family is not your late-night punchline. They are public servants. Mrs. Trump is a private woman who never asked for this circus. But she carried herself with grace while being attacked by people like you who never had the decency to say it to her face." That line made the chamber stir again. Because beneath the political drama, Leavitt was reminding them of something deeper: dignity. It wasn't a word you hear much in politics anymore, but in that moment, it mattered. Carville adjusted his notes, but the control had already slipped. The woman he likely underestimated, this young firebrand from New Hampshire, wasn't just surviving the hearing, she was owning it. By the end of part 1, the narrative was shattered. This wasn't going to be a public shaming of Trump's legacy, not if Leavitt had anything to say about it. She had taken the opening attack and returned it with steel and poise. She hadn't just held her ground, she had redrawn the map, and for every American watching, especially those who had grown tired of being told their values were outdated, their patriotism misplaced, or their faith unfashionable, Caroline Leavitt was doing something powerful. She was speaking not just to James Carville, she was speaking for them. Caroline Leavitt's opening words in the Senate chamber didn't just land, they reverberated. After her icy but resolute rebuttal, the temperature in the room shifted. The tone had been set. Carville's trademark sarcasm, which had played so well in cable news studios for decades, suddenly felt dated. His jab at Melania Trump, calling her a photo op trapped in a soap opera. Administration had drawn a few cautious chuckles, but now those chuckles were curdling into discomfort. And the young woman across the table, she hadn't just deflected. She had reframed the battlefield. Leavitt didn't flinch, didn't blink, and certainly didn't retreat. Her words: "When men attack women for their marriages, it's not strategy, it's cowardice," hung in the air like a warning bell, not just to Carville, but to the entire Senate panel and to the millions watching across the country. The old rules were gone. This wasn't about defending a person, it was about defending dignity. And from the look in her eyes, Leavitt wasn't done. Carville tried to brush it off, though the smirk was thinner now. He leaned in again, his voice a little sharper, his rhythm just slightly rushed. "Look, I've been around politics long enough to know a manufactured image when I see one," he said. Trump White House was a photo shoot every holiday, every handshake, every tweet. What we saw wasn't leadership, it was packaging. The sentence was clever, polished, but something was missing: truth, and the audience could feel it. Leavitt sat still, then leaned forward, not much, just enough to signal she was stepping into the fire. Her voice was calm, but behind it was the weight of conviction. "You want to talk about manufactured images," she said. "Let's talk about manufactured outrage. For 4 years, the media obsessed over Melania's heels, her accent, her silence, but never her strength. They mocked her Christmas decorations, but never praised her hospital visits. And now here you are, dragging a mother into a political hearing as if her worth depends on your approval." The room tightened. Even some on the opposing side looked momentarily uncertain. Leavitt wasn't grandstanding. She was telling a deeper truth, one that resonated with every grandmother who'd ever been judged by outsiders, every mother who'd endured unfair labels, every wife who stood beside a man through fire and rain. In that moment, Melania Trump wasn't just the former First Lady. She was every woman who had been reduced to a punchline because she didn't fit someone else's narrative. Then came the pivot. "But this hearing isn't really about Melania, is it?" Leavitt continued, her gaze locking directly with Carville's. "It's about power. The power to shame, the power to distract, and the hope that if you throw enough dirt, something might stick. You don't want to talk about policy because when we do, the numbers get inconvenient. Boom. The shift from moral to political was seamless and devastating. You said the Trump White House was a soap opera, she said. Let me tell you what that soap opera accomplished. The lowest unemployment rate in half a century. Tax cuts that helped small businesses stay alive. Veterans who finally saw the VA cleaned up. A southern border being secured instead of ignored. Carville tried to respond, but this wasn't cable TV. He didn't have a host to cut to commercial or shift the subject. Leavitt had the floor, and she wasn't finished. She continued, "Do you remember what dignity used to mean in this town, Mr. Carville? It meant not dragging a man's wife into a hearing to score cheap political points. It meant debating policy, not personalities. But today we're living in a moment where people think trending on Twitter is more important than telling the truth." The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from boredom or disinterest, but from reflection. A silence that says, "She's right, and we know it." Leavitt's delivery was cool and methodical, but her words carried the heat of truth. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't overplaying. She was performing surgery with language. With every sentence, she exposed the game behind the attack paint, Trump's family as dysfunctional hope that shame sticks, and distract from the substance that actually affects Americans. She paused briefly, then closed the exchange with a statement that felt more like a signature than a line, "Mr. Carville, you can throw stones all day long, but it won't build a single home, create a single job, or fix a single veteran's wound. And if you want to play pundit, that's fine. Just don't pretend it's leadership." And just like that, round one was over. But the impact was just beginning. Phones buzzed, hashtags started to form. On social media, clips of the exchange began circulating in real time. The phrase "manufactured outrage" became a trend within minutes. Conservative voices praised Leavitt's poise. Even moderate commentators noted the imbalance in tone. Leavitt stood for substance. Carville leaned on sarcasm. More importantly, average Americans, especially older viewers, felt something they hadn't felt in years represented. They weren't watching just another partisan brawl. They were watching someone stand up for respect, for family, for the values that made America strong. And as Leavitt sat back in her chair, hands calmly folded, she didn't need to celebrate or gloat. She didn't need to smile or bask in the reaction, because she knew when you speak truth with clarity and courage, the results speak for themselves. Carville looked down at his notes. He would try again in the next round. But everyone knew the momentum had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. Leavitt hadn't come to play a role. She had come to remind America what it looks like when grace meets grit and wins. Caroline Leavitt didn't come to the Senate chamber to win applause. She came to draw lines, expose spin, and speak directly to the people who felt forgotten. And as round two began, that mission became even clearer. After dismantling James Carville's personal attacks in round one, she now faced something more insidious, the well-worn economic narrative that had been repeated for years that Trump's tariff policy was a reckless gamble. Carville knew his next move needed to shift the momentum, but what he didn't know was that Leavitt had already seen the punch coming. Let's be honest, Carville began standing tall and scanning the chamber. Trump's tariffs were a disaster. Our farmers paid the price. Small businesses struggled, and the so-called America First policy only made things worse. He flipped to a chart blurry from distance, uncredited in its source, showing a steep dip in soybean prices. "Ask anyone in Iowa or Kansas," he said, pointing at the screen. "They'll tell you these policies didn't protect them. They punished them." The jab was strategic. Carville was counting on familiar talking points: economic pain, trade disruption, angry farmers. But while the chart looked dramatic, the facts were shaky. And worse, Carville had underestimated Leavitt's command of the numbers. She didn't respond with emotion. She responded with data. Leavitt stood, not rushed, but assured. Her words came clean cutting through the noise. "Mr. Carville, you say tariffs were a disaster. But let's talk about what they actually did." She didn't pull out a chart, she brought receipts in the form of hard facts. Since the tariffs were implemented, she said over 1.5 million jobs returned to the United States. 357 companies reshored their operations, moving manufacturing back from China. And we didn't just bring back jobs, we brought back dignity. That's not disaster. That's results. Carville shifted. His fingers fumbled briefly with his notes, but Leavitt wasn't finished. Tariff revenue totaled $130 billion, which was reinvested into infrastructure, roads, bridges, rail. We weren't just taxing China, we were rebuilding America. A few murmurs rose from the gallery. Heads nodded. Someone whispered, "She knows her stuff," Leavitt continued, without skipping a beat. "And while we're on the subject of what your party left behind under your leadership, Mr. Carville China manufactured over 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients. 80%. Our health, our national security was outsourced." She paused for a moment, letting that figure settle. Under President Trump, we began the process of bringing medical production home. That wasn't just a policy decision, that was a wake-up call. COVID exposed what we should have known all along. You don't let foreign governments control your medicine. It wasn't just a response, it was an economic reality check. And for millions of older Americans watching, many of whom rely on prescription drugs and remember what local manufacturing once meant for their hometowns, Leavitt's message hit close to home. Carville tried to respond, but something had changed. He leaned forward, but his tone was less sharp, now more defensive. "Well, sure, some jobs came back," he said, "but prices went up. Inflation hurt working families. Tariffs made goods more expensive." Leavitt didn't flinch. "Inflation," she said. "Let's talk inflation. Under Trump, inflation averaged 1.9%, lower than any year under the Obama-Biden era. Under Trump, we had cheap gas, affordable groceries, and steady cost of living. What we're facing now isn't the result of tariffs. It's the result of reckless spending, shutdown economies, and supply chain dependency that your side defended for decades. Then came the knockout. You want to talk about prices, Leavitt?" said her voice sharpening. "Ask the steelworker in Pennsylvania if his job was worth a few extra cents on imported metal. Ask the farmer in Ohio if he'd rather sell soybeans or collect federal relief. They don't want pity, they want independence. That's what Trump gave them." The room stirred again, but not with noise, with tension. The kind of tension that comes when a long-held narrative starts to fall apart. Carville, now visibly flustered, attempted one final pivot. "We lost international partnerships," he said. "Allies stopped trusting us. Global trade fractured." But Leavitt didn't allow the deflection. "Mr. Carville," she replied firmly, "our trade partners didn't walk away, they renegotiated. And we got better deals because we finally had a leader who wouldn't blink. China didn't get what it wanted. Europe had to listen. And the American worker who'd been ignored for decades was finally heard." She stepped back slightly, not retreating, resetting the board. "America First wasn't isolation," she said. "It was restoration." Silence. Across the country, people were listening, some stunned, some smiling, some teary-eyed. Not because it was flashy or angry, but because it was honest. For the first time in years, someone on a national stage was making the case for economic sovereignty, logic, and loyalty to working Americans, not corporations, not consultants, not global councils. By the time Leavitt returned to her seat, Carville had stopped taking notes. His eyes, which once sparkled with confidence, now flickered with disbelief. Round 2 was over. And Caroline Leavitt hadn't just survived an economic attack, she flipped it, exposing that the so-called disaster of tariffs was in reality the beginning of an American revival. The older generation watching at home understood exactly what she meant. They remembered when things were made in Ohio, not overseas. When their neighbors worked in factories, not fought for gig jobs. When America led by example, not by dependence. And now in front of the nation, someone was finally saying it clearly, logically, and unapologetically. This wasn't a fluke. This was Caroline Leavitt, standing tall in the lion's den and winning with truth. By the time the third round began, the air inside the Senate chamber had shifted entirely. Carville had opened the hearing with swagger and punchlines, expecting to roll over the 27-year-old press secretary with a flurry of insults and insinuations. But after 2 bruising rounds, the veteran strategist was no longer in command. Caroline Leavitt had already dismantled his personal jabs and obliterated his economic attacks with surgical precision, and now he reached for his final, most explosive weapon, the corruption narrative. Carville leaned forward, voice sharper, now tone-tinged with desperation masquerading as outrage. "Let's stop dancing around the truth," he snapped. Qatar jets, Saudi deals, hidden billions, Donald Trump used the presidency like a piggy bank. Foreign powers didn't just shake his hand, they lined his pockets. "And Miss Leavitt, you're defending that," gasps spread across the room. Even some neutral senators sat up straighter. The words were heavy, meant to sting. Corruption, foreign money, betrayal of office. The kind of charges that, if left unanswered, don't just damage a man's reputation, they rewrite his legacy. But Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her eyebrows. Her posture, her presence unchanged. She waited. Then, with that same composed, cutting tone she'd carried all morning, she responded. "Mr. Carville," she said, 600 pages of financial disclosures were filed by President Trump every single year. They were audited, they were public, and they were reviewed by the same institutions that looked the other way when your allies were under fire. And yet in all those pages, all those years, there's one thing missing, a single conviction, not one. Scattered applause broke out. A man in the back shouted, "Bring receipts!" The mood had turned again. Leavitt wasn't dodging. She was delivering. She continued. "Now, let me ask you, sir, how many press statements did you personally draft during the Clinton administration? You remember those years when foreign money was flowing into the Lincoln bedroom and presidential pardons were handed out like candy at a state fair? You were there. You spun it. So let's not pretend you've just now discovered outrage." There was no theatrics in her voice, just calm, relentless exposure. Leavitt wasn't playing defense. She was prosecuting the hypocrisy. Carville shifted uncomfortably, trying to cut in. "That's deflection," he began, but Leavitt cut him off with surgical precision. "No, Mr. Carville, that's perspective. You accuse President Trump of turning the White House into a business, but for 4 years, his family businesses lost revenue. He donated his entire presidential salary every quarter to federal agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Park Service. Meanwhile, under your guidance, the Clintons built a global foundation that just happened to rake in millions, while Hillary served as Secretary of State." The room was now locked in silence, unblinking, unsure whether to gasp or applaud. Leavitt continued, "You want to talk about Saudi Arabia, fine. Every meeting, every deal, every dollar was reported. Meanwhile, your party cut billions in weapons deals to the same regime behind closed doors, and the media called it diplomacy. That double standard is why Americans have stopped listening to pundits and started listening to results." She let the word hang for a second. Results. It was more than a theme, it was a reminder. Then she drove the final nail. "Mr. Carville, you said Trump used the presidency as a piggy bank. Here's a fact. He left office with less money than when he entered it. And he knew that would happen. Because, unlike the career politicians you advise, he didn't run for the perks, he ran to break the machine you built." Boom. There it was. The room burst. Applause erupted, some rising to their feet. Not from partisan fury, but from recognition. Because they remembered what it felt like to see a leader actually lose money while serving. It didn't matter whether they liked Trump or not. What mattered was that someone was finally speaking plainly, without spin, without smears, without fear. Carville was stunned. The smirk was gone. He looked down at his notes, then up again, searching for footing that had already collapsed beneath him. He tried one last time, voice faltering. This isn't about the past, Miss Leavitt. This is about accountability. Leavitt nodded slowly. I agree, she said. So let's be accountable. But that means facts, not feelings. Evidence, not headlines. And until you can bring something other than rumors and recycled talking points, don't expect the American people to buy what you're selling. They've seen your playbook before and they've outgrown it. With that, she sat down. No drama, no posturing, just silence and a stunned chamber. Outside the hearing, social media was already exploding. Hashtag Bring Receipts began trending on X, formerly Twitter. A side-by-side video showing Leavitt's calm rebuttal against Carville's angry accusations reached over 500,000 views within the hour. Commentators from both sides acknowledged it. Carville had come for blood, but Leavitt brought the truth. And more importantly, she brought something else, clarity. To older Americans watching, many of whom have lived through Watergate, Clinton-era scandals, and the shifting morality of Washington, this wasn't just political theater. It was a moment of moral reckoning. For years, they've been told what to think by talking heads who speak louder than they listen. But in Leavitt, they saw a woman who didn't speak. At them, she spoke for them. And she did it with grace, grit, and truth in hand. Round 3 was over, and Caroline Leavitt didn't just survive the corruption smear, she turned it inside out, revealing what Washington rarely admits. Sometimes, the loudest accusations come from the guiltiest corners. By the 4th round, James Carville had thrown everything. He had personal insults, economic criticism, and corruption allegations. But Caroline Leavitt, with poise and precision, had dismantled them all. Each attack, once assumed to be a guaranteed blow, had turned into an opportunity for her to speak truth, expose hypocrisy, and bring the audience back to what mattered most: facts, leadership, and dignity. But now the final battleground emerged: foreign policy and America's role in the world. And Carville was ready to light the match. He leaned in, his tone now dripping with condescension. Let's not kid ourselves, he said with that familiar drawl. Trump alienated our allies. NATO was insulted. The UN laughed at us. Our foreign policy wasn't leadership, it was isolation, and the damage will take years to undo. There was a momentary stir in the room. The accusation sounded sharp, confident, and to the untrained ear convincing. But Carville forgot one thing. He wasn't debating a spokesperson who read from a script. He was standing across from a woman who had done her homework and lived the results. Caroline Leavitt didn't hesitate. She lifted her head, eyes locked on him, her voice unwavering. Mr. Carville, she began, what you call insult, others call accountability. What you call alienation, Americans called strength. And what you frame as laughter, history will remember, as the moment we stood up for ourselves again. She let the words land, then pressed forward sharper now. Under President Trump, NATO members increased defense spending by 25%. Not because he begged them, because he demanded they pull their weight. For decades, the United States carried the bill while Europe looked the other way. Trump changed that. And for the first time, NATO didn't just talk, they paid. Gasps turned into nods. The message was cutting through. And while we're on the subject of international respect, she added, Trump brokered peace deals between Israel and multiple Arab nations. The Abraham Accords, no bloodshed, no endless negotiations, just results, real diplomacy, the kind that your party said was impossible. Carville looked down, jotting something on his notes, but his hand trembled slightly. She wasn't done. You bring up the UN. Laughing, she said. Let me ask you something. Since when did Americans measure success by the laughter of bureaucrats who coddle dictators and fund resolutions against our closest ally, Israel? The world laughed at Reagan too, until the Berlin Wall came down. The crowd stirred again. Leavitt had just done what few in politics can do. She tied today's fight to a broader legacy of American power, pride, and moral clarity. She turned back to Carville, her words steady and final. President Trump didn't make America laughed at. He made it feared, and he made it respected. It wasn't just a line, it was a declaration, and it landed like a thunderclap. Reporters began scribbling. Some in the gallery leaned forward. Even Carville, once the lion of Democratic spin, now looked like he was trying to remember how to respond. Leavitt didn't gloat. She clarified. You say he was dangerous, she continued. But let's look at the scoreboard. No new wars. Not one. First president in decades to say that. He stepped into North Korea, something no prior president dared. And guess what? No missiles hit Japan during his presidency. Iran didn't escalate. Russia paused. China reconsidered. She paused, then leaned in slightly. Because for once, the world wasn't looking at a politician. They were looking at a fighter. The applause that followed wasn't wild, it was firm, earned, and from the heart. Because deep down, many Americans, especially the older generation, remember what strength looked like. They knew the cost of weakness. And they saw in Leavitt's words something long missing from Washington clarity without apology. Carville scrambled for a reply. But we lost friends' alliances weakened. He cozied up to tyrants. Leavitt didn't blink. He negotiated with enemies and kept them in check. That's called strategy. Meanwhile, under your guidance, America entered 2 wars, spilled trillions of dollars, and buried thousands of brave soldiers. Was that diplomacy? The room fell still. It wasn't a jab. It was a wound. And Leavitt wasn't trying to score points. She was pulling the curtain back. You accuse President Trump of being transactional, she said, her tone now softened but resolute. But your party's version of diplomacy was to beg foreign leaders, send them pallets of cash, and call it peace. Carville tried again, voice thinner. He alienated Europe. She stopped him cold, and brought American jobs back home. You keep talking about how the world saw us. Let's talk about how Americans felt. Safer, stronger, employed, proud. That was it. The room shifted again, not because of volume, but because of truth. For the millions watching at home, especially those old enough to remember the Cold War, Vietnam, or the fall of the Twin Towers, Leavitt's words rang with something rare moral certainty, backed by factual strength. She wasn't reading lines, she was defending principles that had held this country together for generations. America First wasn't about turning our backs on the world, it was about remembering who we are. By the time she took her seat again, Carville sat back, deflated. He had entered the chamber expecting to teach her a lesson. Instead, he got one delivered with elegance, discipline, and more historical weight than he could counter. Round 4 ended the way no one expected, with the young press secretary not just defending Trump's foreign policy, but defining it. Clearly, boldly, without spin. The world may have laughed in global chambers, but America remembered who it was, and Caroline Leavitt made sure they wouldn't forget again. 4 rounds in, and the storm had already passed through the room. Personal attacks shattered. Economic accusations reversed. Corruption smears exposed. Foreign policy jabs refuted with facts. Clarity and steel. Caroline Leavitt hadn't just stood her ground. She'd redrawn the battlefield. Now in the 6th and final round, the hearing had one thing left to deliver, the knockout. And when it came, it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, measured, devastating. James Carville, once the lion of Democratic political warfare, now looked visibly agitated. The cool sarcasm had evaporated. His notes were a mess, his shirt collar slightly askew, and his voice had lost that smug, measured rhythm. He had been outmatched, not just in message, but in mindset. And as Caroline delivered her final rebuttal, Carville did something uncharacteristic. Mr. Carville, she began what you call insult, others call accountability. What you call alienation, Americans called strength. And what you frame as laughter, history will remember as the moment we stood up for ourselves again. She let the words land, then pressed forward sharper now. Under President Trump, NATO members increased defense spending by 25%. Not because he begged them, because he demanded they pull their weight. For decades, the United States carried the bill while Europe looked the other way. Trump changed that. And for the first time, NATO didn't just talk, they paid. Gasps turned into nods. The message was cutting through. And while we're on the subject of international respect, she added Trump brokered peace deals between Israel and multiple Arab nations. The Abraham Accords, no bloodshed, no endless negotiations, just results. Real diplomacy, the kind that your party said was impossible. Carville looked down, jotting something on his notes, but his hand trembled slightly. She wasn't done. You bring up the UN, laughing, she said. Let me ask you something. Since when did Americans measure success? By the laughter of bureaucrats who coddle dictators and fund resolutions against our closest ally, Israel. The world laughed at Reagan too, until the Berlin Wall came down. The crowd stirred again. Leavitt had just done what few in politics can do. She tied today's fight to a broader legacy of American power, pride, and moral clarity. She turned back to Carville, her words steady and final. President Trump didn't make America laughed at. He made it feared, and he made it respected. It wasn't just a line. It was a declaration, and it landed like a thunderclap. Reporters began scribbling. Some in the gallery leaned forward. Even Carville, once the lion of democratic spin, now looked like he was trying to remember how to respond. Leavitt didn't gloat. She clarified. You say he was dangerous, she continued. But let's look at the scoreboard. No new wars, not one. First president in decades to say that. He stepped into North Korea, something no prior president dared. And guess what? No missiles hit Japan during his presidency. Iran didn't escalate. Russia paused. China reconsidered. She paused, then leaned in slightly. Because for once, the world wasn't looking at a politician. They were looking at a fighter. The applause that followed wasn't wild, it was firm, earned, and from the heart. Because deep down, many Americans, especially the older generation, remember what strength looked like. They knew the cost of weakness, and they saw in Leavitt's words something long missing from Washington clarity without apology. Carville scrambled for a reply. But we lost friends, alliances weakened. He cozied up to tyrants, Leavitt didn't blink. He negotiated with enemies and kept them in check. That's called strategy. Meanwhile, under your guidance, America entered 2 wars, spilled trillions of dollars, and buried thousands of brave soldiers. Was that diplomacy? The room fell still. It wasn't a jab, it was a wound. And Leavitt wasn't trying to score points, she was pulling the curtain back. You accuse President Trump of being transactional, she said, her tone now softened but resolute. But your party's version of diplomacy was to beg foreign leaders, send them pallets of cash, and call it peace. Carville tried again, voice thinner. He alienated Europe. She stopped him cold, and brought American jobs back home. You keep talking about how the world saw us. Let's talk about how Americans felt. Safer, stronger, employed, proud. That was it. The room shifted again, not because of volume, but because of truth. For the millions watching at home, especially those old enough to remember the Cold War, Vietnam, or the fall of the Twin Towers, Leavitt's words rang with something rare moral certainty, backed by factual strength. She wasn't reading lines, she was defending principles that had held this country together for generations. America First wasn't about turning our backs on the world, it was about remembering who we are. By the time she took her seat again, Carville sat back deflated. He had entered the chamber expecting to teach her a lesson. Instead, he got one delivered with elegance, discipline, and more historical weight than he could counter. Round 4 ended the way no one expected, with the young press secretary not just defending Trump's foreign policy, but defining it. Clearly, boldly, without spin. The world may have laughed in global chambers, but America remembered who it was, and Caroline Leavitt made sure they wouldn't forget again. 4 rounds in, and the storm had already passed through the room. Personal attacks shattered. Economic accusations reversed. Corruption smears exposed. Foreign policy jabs refuted with facts, clarity, and steel. Caroline Leavitt hadn't just stood her ground, she had redrawn the battlefield. Now, in the 6th and final round, The hearing had one thing left to deliver the knockout. And when it came, it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, measured, devastating. James Carville, once the lion of Democratic political warfare, now looked visibly agitated. The cool sarcasm had evaporated. His notes were a mess, his shirt collar slightly askew, and his voice had lost that smug, measured rhythm. He had been outmatched, not just in message, but in mindset. And as Caroline delivered her final rebuttal, Carville did something uncharacteristic. He tried to interrupt. He leaned forward, desperate to regain control, cutting into her sentence with a raised hand and shaky voice. But Leavitt didn't flinch. She didn't scold. She didn't shout. She simply raised her own hand, calm, firm, and commanding. "I'm not done, sir." The room froze. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. With absolute control, the kind of control that silences chaos. That one line didn't just hush Carville, it reversed the power dynamic entirely. He had entered this hearing expecting to bury a rising star. Instead, he'd been outclassed by a young woman half his age with twice his discipline. Leavitt then delivered her closing line. No venom, no theatrics, just the clean, final truth. "Mr. Carville, you built a career on spinning stories. I built mine on speaking truth. One of us is outdated. I'll let the American people decide which." Boom. That was the moment. The moment when the entire hearing stopped being a debate and became a turning point. Carville's face flushed. He looked down at the desk, then up again, smiling, but not from confidence. It was the kind of smile a man wears when he knows he's just been beaten and is trying to hide it from the cameras. But the cameras had already captured it. The nation had already seen it. Across America, screens lit up. Social media clips began spreading like wildfire. On X, the phrase "I'm not done, sir" began trending instantly. Young voters shared it, veterans reposted it, seniors quoted it. She hadn't yelled, hadn't mocked. She had simply taken control with dignity. And to the millions watching at home, especially the 65 and up generation, Leavitt's words echoed far beyond that Senate hearing. Because they've lived through decades of politicians spinning, blaming, dodging, and gaslighting. They know what it sounds like when someone's just talking to talk. But what they saw in Caroline was different. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was standing for something. This wasn't about Trump alone. It was about how we debate, how we treat one another, how we defend truth without apology and confront arrogance without rage. Leavitt didn't just win the hearing. She reminded America that courage doesn't need volume, that respect doesn't require age. And that truth, when delivered with conviction, doesn't just change minds, it changes momentum. Her closing line wasn't just a mic drop, it was a mirror. "Mr. Carville, you built a career on spinning stories. I built mine on speaking truth." That contrast, it wasn't just rhetorical, it defined two eras. Carville represented the past clever, calculating, comfortable with contradiction. Leavitt represented the future sharp, grounded, unwilling to play the game by broken rules. As Carville leaned back trying to regain his composure, Leavitt simply gathered her notes. Not a trace of gloating, not a moment of arrogance. Because she didn't need to posture. She had done what she came to do, and the people knew it. Outside, the press swarmed. Headlines exploded. Leavitt silenced his Carville with one line. "The future just arrived and she's 27. Even left-leaning outlets reluctantly admitted the power of the moment. One commentator said Carville came to corner her. Instead, she wrote the story. But it wasn't just the media that noticed. It was regular Americans, factory workers, in Ohio, veterans, in Arizona, grandmothers in Wisconsin, farmers in Texas, who saw a woman standing in front of the system and saying, "Enough," and doing it without fear, without bitterness, and without blinking. And as she walked out of the hearing room, not once looking back, the story was no longer about James Carville or even Donald Trump. It was about a shift. The crowd didn't cheer like at a rally. They didn't chant. But many nodded. Some teared up. Because in Caroline Leavitt, they saw a bridge between generations, between parties, between what America was and what it could be again. Not loud, not angry, just resolute, and sometimes that's all it takes to shake the ground. The hearing may have ended in silence, but the aftermath hit like a thunderclap. Caroline Leavitt's quiet command, "I'm not done, sir," didn't just silence James Carville. It shook the digital world wide awake. Within minutes of the closing gavel, America wasn't just reacting, it was exploding. Hashtag Leave It Unshaken rocketed to the #1 trend on X, formerly Twitter, within the hour. Millions of users, young, old, left, right, independent, were all chiming in. What began as a generational clash inside a Senate hearing had transformed into a full-blown cultural moment, something rare and raw in today's overly produced political landscape. But it wasn't just about politics, it was about tone, style, character. Caroline hadn't insulted Carville. She hadn't mocked or belittled. Instead, she had done something that felt almost revolutionary. In 2025, she held the line with composure, with facts, and with dignity, and America noticed. TikTok, the domain of Gen Z, lit up with remix after remix of her iconic phrase. One clip layered her words over a marching drum beat, ending with her turning away from the podium, like a general walking off the battlefield. It hit 1 million views in under 2 hours. Another clip showed side-by-side footage, Carville waving papers, red-faced and agitated, Leavitt, calm hand, raised eyes steady, uttering just 5 words. "I'm not done, sir." The caption, "When your 1990 strategy meets a 2025 lion." That meme caught fire. Boomers laughed. Millennials reposted. Gen Z danced to it. But more importantly, it resonated. It cut across the generational divide and landed in a space where Americans of all stripes could agree they had just witnessed something honest, something rare. It wasn't about whether you agreed with her politics, it was about how she carried them. For the generation that grew up watching Reagan at a podium or Margaret Thatcher at the UN, Caroline Leavitt's moment felt familiar but new. She wasn't mimicking strength, she embodied it. In the hours following the hearing, major outlets scrambled to catch up. Fox News ran the headline, "Leavitt dismantles Carville," with a raised hand and 5 words. Newsmax called her the unshaken star of the new right. Even CNN, typically critical, ran a panel where one anchor admitted, "Whether you agree with her or not, that's one of the sharpest performances we've seen in years." Another analyst added, "Carville underestimated her, and now the entire country knows it." But it wasn't just the networks, it was the people. In Facebook comment threads and community forums, retired veterans, Sunday school teachers, small business owners, and suburban moms weighed in. One post read, "I don't care if she's 27. She spoke like someone who's lived 100 years of American wisdom." Another wrote, "My husband fought in Vietnam. I've seen leaders come and go. That girl, she's the real thing." Across YouTube, compilations of the hearing were uploaded within hours. One titled "Leavitt versus Carville," the Senate showdown garnered over 2 million views by the end of the day. Another called "This is How You Debate with Class" showed only her responses, each calm, firm, unshaken. It wasn't just a win, it was a generational reset. By midnight, political influencers were calling it a Leavitt effect. Young conservatives praised her precision. Older voters called her refreshing, elegant, and what we've been waiting for. A few even compared her to Margaret Chase Smith, the late senator from Maine who once stood against McCarthyism, not with anger, but with strength and principle. Meanwhile, James Carville became the center of a very different storm. Memes flooded the internet. One showed him with the caption, "When you bring CNN talking points to a facts fight." Another featured his face mid-reaction to Leavitt's line with, "He wasn't ready." Even traditional Democrats began distancing themselves. One progressive commentator tweeted, "Carville underestimated a woman who came, prepared, respectful, and real. That's not just a loss, it's a message." Another admitted, "It's hard to spin this one. She came, she spoke, and she delivered." Leavitt, however, didn't jump into the spotlight. She didn't race to Twitter to celebrate or brag. Instead, she returned quietly to her office. Aides said she sat down, reviewed her notes, and took a moment to reflect. Later that evening, she posted one simple message on social media: "Truth doesn't shout. It stands." 8 words, tens of thousands of shares. The hearing that was supposed to showcase Carville's wisdom ended up showcasing Leavitt's conviction. And while the Senate lights dimmed and the chatter died down inside the building, outside, in America's living rooms, churches, diners, and union halls, the impact was just beginning. For older Americans who have seen leaders come and go, who've heard it all before, Caroline Leavitt didn't offer more noise. She offered clarity. Her poise reminded them of when political courage meant standing calmly in the fire, not shouting across the room. She reminded them of something they feared was gone. And the younger generation, they saw a woman unafraid to hold her own against a political juggernaut, not with viral antics, but with grace and a raised hand. That's why it stuck. Carville came to write her headline, but Leavitt wrote her legacy. As the dust settled and the hearing room emptied, Caroline Leavitt didn't linger for cameras or applause. She walked out the same way she had walked in, quietly, head high, purpose steady. While the nation buzzed over memes, headlines, and hashtags, she returned to a small office just down the hall. No entourage, no fanfare, just a desk, a photo frame, and her own thoughts. There, resting beside a stack of worn legal pads and briefing folders, was a picture of her son. She paused, picked it up, and smiled. Not the smile of a politician basking in victory, but of a mother reminded of why she fights at all. In that one moment, it became clear to anyone watching from afar, this wasn't about scoring points or one-upping a legend. This was about defending a future worth handing down. She took a deep breath, and opened her phone. Hundreds of notifications flashed across the screen, messages from supporters, veterans, students, single moms, small business owners, and quietly listening, Americans who had felt forgotten. But one message stopped her in her tracks. It was from a Vietnam veteran in rural Missouri. The message read, "You defended him, but really, you defended all of us." She read it twice. That simple line, 12 words, carried more weight than any headline, because it confirmed what so many Americans had already begun to realize. This wasn't just a performance. This wasn't just about Trump. It was about something deeper, a generational reckoning. A moment when someone finally stood up and said what millions had long felt few dared to say in a place that mattered. Leavitt hadn't come to the hearing to become a symbol, but she left as one. Over the past hour, she had outmaneuvered one of the most seasoned political operatives in modern American history. But more than that, she had done what no shouting match or viral stunt ever could. She restored respect to the public square. And the people saw it. For the generation that remembers when politicians could disagree without disgrace, Leavitt felt like a breath of long-lost air. For those who remember JFK's cool resolve, Reagan's clarity, or even Truman's straight talk, there was something in her tone, something old, yet urgently needed again. Not slick, not robotic, not performative. Just real. She wasn't pretending to be the voice of a movement. She simply was. And that authenticity is why the older generation, so often dismissed as out of touch, found themselves saying, "Finally, she gets it." In community halls across the country, conversations unfolded over coffee and breakfast plates. In VFW lodges and senior centers, the hearing played on rerun. What struck people wasn't just that she won, it was how she won. With facts, with restraint, with courage, and without ever lowering herself to the level of those who tried to provoke her. As one commentator put it later that evening, she didn't just win a debate. She changed the rhythm of American politics. It wasn't exaggeration. The cultural tempo had shifted. In a world flooded with noise, she had made silence powerful again. In an era of insults, she had made respect feel like rebellion. And in a political system worn down by cynicism, she had sparked something radical: hope. Not naive hope, not empty slogans, but grounded American hope, the kind built on discipline, faith, and unapologetic truth. By the next morning, newspapers across the country told the story in bold print. The Lion and the Lamb Carville undone by composure. A star rises with a whisper, not a roar. Leavitt brings grace back to Washington. But even those headlines couldn't capture what had happened, because what had happened wasn't just political, it was personal. For the veteran who saw his sacrifices respected, for the grandmother who prayed someone would speak plainly again, for the father who wanted to believe his kids would grow up in a country with backbone, and for the millions who had been told their values were outdated, their patriotism mocked, and their voice unwelcome. Caroline Leavitt had spoken to all of them, and she had done it without chasing likes, without begging applause, and without apologizing for her convictions. She reminded America that being young doesn't mean being shallow, that being conservative doesn't mean being cruel, that standing firm doesn't require raising your voice, and that truth spoken with courage still carries weight even in halls that have forgotten it. As the final clips of the hearing circulated online and the country returned to its daily rhythms, one thing had changed. A new name had entered the national conversation, not because she shouted, but because she stood. And whether she meant to or not, Caroline Leavitt had become something bigger than a press secretary. She had become a symbol of what's still possible in American public life, a future that doesn't erase the past but honors it. A voice that doesn't follow polls but follows principle. A leader not made by the system but forged by conviction. And in that quiet office, as she looked once more at the photo of her son, she didn't need a speechwriter to capture the moment. She had already lived it. In a world that often rewards volume over virtue, Caroline Leavitt reminded us that quiet strength still wins. Her composure under fire wasn't just a political victory, it was a lesson for all of us. In life, we will face people who try to belittle, distract, or provoke us. But we don't have to meet chaos with more chaos. Sometimes the most powerful response is calm truth spoken with conviction. For older Americans who've lived through generations of political promises and cultural shifts, Leavitt's stand was a return to something familiar: dignity, discipline, and moral courage. She didn't yell, she didn't insult, she just stood firm, and that's something we can all apply. Whether it's in our families, communities, or church halls, there's power in staying grounded in truth when the world pushes back. Let this story be a reminder that age doesn't define wisdom, character does, and that even in today's divided times, grace still has a place in public life. What did you think of Leavitt's performance? Did it remind you of a leader from your time? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a moment where truth stands tall again.